Hello everyone and welcome. It's Morgana here today, and today's demonstration is this beautiful low tide rocky beach scene. To start with, I've just got a simple piece of cotton watercolour paper. This is hot press paper, so it's very smooth and there's very little texture on it. So I'm going to be working to create my own textures today, and using my lovely Daler Rowney Skyflow brush, which certainly lives up to its name, I'm beginning with the sky. I'm just wetting the paper until about 2/3 of the way down. With this lovely hot press paper, it's really important to make sure it's nice and wet before you start adding the colour, because it soaks in the water and this really just helps to spread it around a bit. I apologise for the reflections on the paper you're seeing. The sun was very bright coming in through my window while I was painting. But as you can see, I'm beginning with a lovely blue colour. This is sky blue. This is actually one of my own handmade paints that I'm using, but you could easily substitute something like cerulean blue, something lovely and light and bright. And I'm just sweeping it across the paper using the edge of this lovely wash brush to get some really nice streaks and some lovely texture, some lovely clouds going on across that beautiful blue sky. I'm keeping them quite horizontal, a little bit of curve towards the top, but not sort of trying to do too many rounded clouds. I'm keeping the colour relatively pale the closer I get towards the horizon line, and introducing stronger colours further up the page and just blending it in with this lovely brush. Incidentally, if you are in the market for a synthetic wash brush, I cannot recommend this one highly enough. It's the 2-inch one that I'm using. I believe they come in sizes 1 inch, 2 inch and 3 inch. For me, this is the perfect size for painting on this size paper. This is 1/4 of an imperial sheet, so a little under A3 size. And you can see I can use the tips to just sweep across and fill in any sort of corners and edges, and getting this lovely sort of soft clouded sky effect. And with the remainder of paint on my brush, you can see how pale that is. That's pretty much just paint water at this point, and my brush is only just damp, so I'm able to dry brush this onto the paper, leaving just these slight horizontal marks, which is going to serve as a base for our rocky shoreline. So beginning to add our lovely rocks and tide pools. You can see again, using this lovely flat brush, I've dunked it in what is essentially Payne's Grey mostly at the moment, with a touch of ultramarine added to give it a little extra hint of blue and to help with the granulation. And I'm just making these flat marks, just dotting the very tips of the bristles along the page to form the basis of our rock formations. So lovely, give a lovely bit of structure to our beach. You can see here I've also begun to add a little extra colour. This is a mix of raw umber and raw sienna that I'm adding in here alongside the Payne's Grey and ultramarine. I'm not keeping these colours separate. I think these colours work really well together, so on my palette I'm allowing them to sort of mix and muddle up, and you can see as I'm dotting in the shapes with my brush, they're coming out with lots of different colours, which is done to imitate the sort of natural marbling you often get on these lovely rock formations. Very rarely is it all just one colour. You get a lovely blend of sort of browns and greys and darks, which is what I'm trying to imitate here. Of course, you could use a smaller brush if you don't feel confident with the large 2-inch one, but for me this is a really quick, easy and efficient way of creating some really interesting marks. You can see you can use the tip and just sweep across there. I'm sweeping across that lower right hand corner and just going to create some interesting texture really. That's what we're after today, filling in that beach scene rather than just having a sandy beach. There's some joy in a rocky shoreline as well. And now I'm switching to a smaller brush just to fill in the headland over on the left side, and I'm using some much lighter paint. You can see this is really watered down. This is the burnt sienna and raw umber combination. You can see it's going on nice and pale there, just stuffing in a little bit of beach, and then I'm coming in and doing a little bit more dry brush, and again it's just building up texture at this point. This is my palette. You can see this very loose runny paint is what I'm using for this next bit. Just going to put a little bit of distant headland, a little bit of distant cliffs in. So getting that first initial stroke in. This is actually a Winsor & Newton one stroke brush and you can see why it's called that. Getting a lovely light stroke in first with a lot of Payne's grey, and then just going over this top part, which is going to be the distant headland, with a little bit of extra raw sienna to give it a little bit of body and differentiate it out. So we've got a lovely shape being created there. And now with the smaller flat brush, I'm able to put in a little bit of extra detail, a little bit more fine than the big brush was able to do. I'm going to be switching between the two. This is an exercise in flat brushing, you could call it. But on a more serious note, this is a lovely technique for putting in this sort of texture and these sort of loose rocks and details really quickly and easily. Just a little bit of control on that brush and you can get some really nice results with quite minimal time. You see now how I'm flicking the brush down, getting it nice and flat and even, and using the very tips of the bristles, placing it upon the page and then just pulling downwards, and I'm getting these lovely textural sort of diagonal stripes coming down from the darker marks there, which are just going to imitate again these lovely rocky pools that we're creating. Now I've allowed that first layer of detail to dry. It's come out a little pale, so all I'm doing now is again using the one stroke brush and filling in a little bit of extra dark, just using Payne's grey here to add a little bit of extra darkness and shadow to really sort of make these lovely rock formations we're creating stand out and look a little bit three-dimensional, just give them a little bit of extra body and structure. And now just adding in a little extra raw sienna, quite thickly, quite rich paint here, dotting it into where the wet Payne's grey is and allowing it to diffuse, and again just getting a nice marbled effect. I think these two colours work really well together. The Payne's grey and the raw sienna, they mingle really nicely. And now I decided to get a little bit of extra depth in that background to add some smaller, very distant sort of rocky formations back at the sort of base of that cliff edge that we've put in there. So all I'm doing is again using the flat brush to create exactly very similar shapes to the ones in the foreground, but on a much smaller scale, obviously, because they're far away, so they're going to look a lot smaller. And I'm also not using as thick a paint, I'm using quite thin paint. I'm going to allow it to dry quite pale. I'm not going to go over it too much because when you are looking across a vast distance, items in the background often appear paler to us than items in the foreground. So you can see those rock formations there have dried quite pale, which gives us a lovely sense of distance in this piece. And now I couldn't resist a little more blue. This is using the fan brush to add in a little bit of extra detail here in the foreground and basically fill in these lovely tide pools with some water, reflecting those beautiful, the beautiful sky above that we've created, that lovely wistful sky with those sweeping clouds and lovely texture. So I'm using the fan brush very lightly to just sweep across and basically just dry brush in some of these foreground rock pools. Just using a little bit of this lovely sky blue and basically trying not to overdo it, making sure I leave a little bit of white. Again, the dry brush sparkle here really helps to give the impression of the glint, the ripple of light on the water's surface. So it's not sort of a flat mirrored surface. You imagine a sort of a lovely wind-blown rock pool. That's the effect that we're going for here, but that's still reflecting that beautiful blue sky above. And now just using the fan brush again to just add a little bit of extra detail and texture. Entirely optional, but I can't resist fiddling sometimes. So now this is all pretty much dry. I've decided to add a couple of figures into the composition. A pair of hikers perhaps who've clambered up this lovely rockfall and are now surveying the beautiful bay beyond them. So I'm using a very fine brush here. This is a Pro Arte Series 60 Masterstroke miniature brush, size 4/0. It's very fine. Obviously any fine brush would do. Something that comes to a nice sharp point like a calligraphy brush would be ideal. And I'm starting with quite thin paint. This is just a really sort of thin mixture of raw sienna and Payne's grey. It looks quite grubby. But I think a mix like this is the best way to start painting in a figure. And just working from the top downwards, just painting in some loose details, just loose shapes for the legs and the body, a slight bend for the arm there. And if you use a sort of a very light and loose mixture like this to paint in your figure, once you're happy with the shape that you created, you can then go in with a little bit of dark paint and just dot it in whilst it's still wet and let it flow in to emphasize certain parts of the figure, perhaps the head, the arm, the crook of the elbow, and a little bit around one side of the leg. just to give the impression of light and shadow falling on your distant figure so they don't look too flat and two-dimensional. And exactly the same technique for figure number 2. And a finishing touch, a handful of seagulls. Those of you who watch my videos a lot know that I can never resist scattering a few birds across a beautiful sky. And of course, what is a seashore without some gulls? Again, just using the very fine brush for this, using the sludgy mixture of raw sienna and Payne's grey, and doing the sort of classic V shape for seagulls, but making sure to vary the size and the wing placement and scattering them in a sort of natural drift across this lovely sky. And here we are with the finished painting, taking the tape off, always a lovely satisfying moment, as long as you don't whack the camera whilst you're doing it like I just did. All good fun. And the lovely thing about taping the paper to the board before painting, of course, is partly that you get this lovely white border once you're finished, but also it really holds the paper down and makes sure it doesn't buckle too much whilst you're painting, gives you a little bit of extra freedom. So here we are with the finished painting. Thank you everybody for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this one. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Please leave a like or subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. And please feel free to check out my Patreon page as well, where you'll find all sorts of bits and bobs and extra videos such as this there as well. So that's all from me today. Thank you everyone so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.